What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. In February 2022, the world watched as Russia initiated its invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that would soon change the geopolitical scene of the entire world. This war, however, has not only left its mark on Ukraine, but has also rippled through the core of Russian society. Over the past year, and especially since early August of this year, the Russian public has begun to question the justifications for this war, the competence of the military, and most importantly, the leadership of President Vladimir Putin. As the toll of this war grows, so does the opposition within Russia. It is not that obvious yet. It is not the same as it was with Navalny, yet, but the process most certainly started. There is a big activation of opposition mood on the Russian social media. The ones who were opposing Putin before are now more convinced more than ever of their position. Those who were indifferent started seeing the complete indifference from the Putin's regime, and those who were supporting him started to question his governance and protective abilities. Today, let's talk about how the ongoing invasion of Ukraine has turned many Russian civilians against Putin, examine the causes of disillusionment, the consequences of the conflict on Russian society, and the potential implications for the future of the country. The early phases of the Russian invasion of Ukraine were marked by widespread media control and a carefully curated narrative in Russia. Yet, as the war dragged on, particularly after Ukraine's significant counteroffensive in 2022 in Kharkiv and in Kherson regions, the cracks in this narrative began to show. At this point, it is relatively safe to say that Russian capturing Kyiv in 3 days operation failed miserably. They struggled a little bit more, advancing here and there, but it was fully over in September 2022 when Ukraine recaptured a big chunk of Kharkiv region. This was the very first example of complete unpreparedness of the Russian military to rapid and surprising attacks by Ukrainians, and something more. Something that would initiate the very first steps of Putin's downfall 2 years later. And this something is complete indifference and ignore of the Russian state media and propaganda of unfortunate for them events. Instead, they mostly called it as goodwill gestures and tried to forget it as soon as possible. And this strategy was quite successful at first. Guess why? Exactly. These combat activities were happening on the territory of Ukraine, so not a single Russian civilian was directly affected by it. The war was far from them. It was on the territory of enemy country. Russians lost this Ukrainian territory as fast as they captured it, and this ownership didn't even have time to register in their minds. So there was not a single person who felt like Russia lost a part of its own territory. So now you can see how much difference the Kursk incursion is in the comparison to these events. This time, it was actual Russian territory. It was the very first invasion by a foreign country's army of Russian land since the Second World War. And most importantly, hundreds of thousands of people directly felt the consequences of war they never started and never asked for. This time it was different, and it only makes sense that the emotions and response by the Russian population was different as well. As the Ukrainian forces continued to make strategic gains, particularly in the Kursk region, the Russian military's response was disjointed and uncoordinated. Reports suggest that entire Russian units were cut off, surrounded, and eliminated by Ukrainian forces. Thousands were captured as POWs, replenishing the Ukrainian exchange fund. But Russians only came to know about these events through military bloggers and other alternative media sources, not the state media. President Putin's delayed response to the invasion of Kursk only further eroded trust in the government's ability to defend its nation. When there is a foreign army literally in your neighborhood, and the authorities simply forget about you like a minor inconvenience, even the biggest Putin supporters will start questioning their loyalties. The public's perception of the war began to shift from one of distant patriotism to a sense of imminent personal threat. And just like mentioned previously, when the war directly affects you, the response is different. Even the Russian military itself, thought by the patriots as an immovable force, when it comes to defending their own territory, showed itself completely incapable of defending the most unstable borders. It was pretty obvious that if Ukraine decides to move the war to the Russian territory, it will happen either in Kursk or in Belgorod regions. There were even several successful cross-border raids in the past, so it would only make sense that the defenses there should be much more professional and prepared than anywhere else. But Russian defenses were in disarray. There are even evidences of poorly trained and ill-equipped conscripts being pushed into literally front lines with little hope of survival. This contrasted sharply with the well-organized and technologically advanced Ukrainian forces, who were able to carry out precise attacks with devastating efficiency. The failure of the Russian military leadership to protect its own soldiers and its own territory brought their credibility and professionalism into question. And the biggest problem with all this, once again, was the use of conscripts, young men. Technically, even according to the Russian law, these literal teenagers can't participate in combat hostilities, but either through tricks and false promises, the use of force and blackmail, or just plain scam, these guys did end up right on the front lines, which obviously started a massive public outrage. The Russian government's promise to keep conscripts out of war had become broken. And it's not like it was the first time ever the government lied to its people. As the casualties mounted, the families of these conscripts began to mobilize, calling for the immediate withdrawal of their sons from the conflict. The dissatisfaction with the military leadership and by extension Putin himself became palpable across Russian society. One of the most significant developments during this period was the rise of civilian activism within Russia. The mothers of conscripts in particular became a powerful voice against the war. This was not the first time Russian mothers had played a role in shaping public's discourse on military matters. During the Soviet-Afghan war in the 1980s, it was the outrage of Russian mothers as well, over the high number of conscript casualties that helped bring an end to the conflict. Now, a similar movement was emerging, with mothers and families of conscripts taking to social media and launching petitions demanding an end to their sons' involvement in the war. The Kremlin's silence in the face of these demands only fueled the growing resentment. A petition launched in August gathered thousands of signatures from Russian families, pleading for the safe return of their sons from the front lines. The petition highlighted the inexperience and lack of training of these young soldiers, many of whom had never fired more than a few rounds before being sent into the battle. From the personal story, by the way guys, I can confirm this. Some of you might remember that I actually went into the Russian military back in 2015, and one of mandatory tests before you can even take an oath is the shooting practice. We're shooting in groups of 5, lying next to each other, each person is given AK-74, and only 5 bullets, that's it. Just 5 bullets is enough to pass the test. Even the score, to be honest, doesn't matter. As long as you make 5 loud noises, check the target for holes, and then the officer signs your paper and pretty much that's it. Now you're a qualified Russian soldier. You take an oath a week later, and that's pretty much it. So I simply can't imagine what kind of input these guys can do against well-trained and well-equipped Ukrainian soldiers. Even as state media continued to downplay the severity of the situation, the truth was becoming harder to suppress. Videos of Russian POWs, many of them the very same young conscripts, surfaced online. These POWs told stories of being outgunned and outmaneuvered by Ukrainian forces. Perhaps even more troubling for the Kremlin than military failures is the shifting attitude among the Russian people. Historically, the Russian population has been slow to openly oppose its government, especially during times of war. However, the invasion of Kursk and the subsequent Russian losses have sparked a growing wave of disagreements within the country. Social media had become a platform for widespread criticism of Putin's handling of the war, with many citizens in Kursk openly condemning the government for its failure to defend the region. One resident's message, for example on social media, perfectly summarizes this growing frustration and goes as following. I don't even know who I hate more now, the Ukrainian army that captured our land or the government that allowed it to happen. This sentiment is spreading, revealing more people that are increasingly dissatisfied with Putin's leadership. And current events are particularly dangerous for the Russian regime. Throughout Russian history, internal unrest has often been the precursor to dramatic political change. In the years leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union, public frustration with the government's inability to manage its affairs played a significant role in the eventual collapse. Similarly, the growing frustration among Russians today could signal the beginning of a broader movement against Putin's leadership, especially as the economic and social costs of the war continue to mount. As the war continued to drag on with no end in sight, the Russian public braced for the possibility of further mobilizations. The Kremlin had already attempted one round of mobilization, which had been met with widespread resistance. Now, with Ukrainian forces advancing on Russian territory, many fear that another, larger mobilization is inevitable. However, the prospect of sending more young men to die in a war that appears increasingly unwinnable is deeply unpopular. Putin's attempts to incentivize volunteers through high pay and promises of rewards did little to inspire a surge of patriotic enlistments. Instead, it became clear that fear, not patriotism, was driving Russian society. The government's failure to secure Russian territory, coupled with the humiliating losses in Kursk, led many Russians to question the very reason why the war started in the first place. What has started as a special military operation to protect Russian-speaking population in Ukraine had now become a full-blown war of attrition, with Russian civilians now also paying the price. The public's patience is wearing thin, as Ukraine received increasing support from Western allies, including large-scale military aid packages. Russia's ability to continue the fight seemed increasingly uncertain. For Putin, his political survival depends on the continuation of the war and the support of the Russian people. But as more Russian families lose their sons and as more of Russia's own territory falls into Ukrainian hands, the question remains: how long will the Russian people continue to support a government that has brought so much death and destruction to their own soil?
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.